Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We have some interesting things to talk about today, although we have to be somewhat quick. As you can see behind me, Judgment Day has come, the rapture is upon us. I don't have too much to fear. I have been pretty good, so I don't fear too much the higher beings about to judge me. However, we have to mention something for today, because, okay, sure, the state of Mythic Plus is pretty cool right now. We have gotten a wave of significant nerfs in Mythic Plus. Just a few days ago, we were mentioning in our Mythic Plus recaps how things were stuck for many players around the 11 to 12 range, and now we are on Monday and you can see all of the highest keys suddenly jumping up to 15s and 14s. You can even see my character, who was just only 4 days ago in his last key, and it was at 2700 rating, which was enough to be in the top 300 of Resto Shaman healers. And look at it, after 4 days of not doing keys, it's down to practically almost 3000. All of the keys being in the top 1000 of keys just 4 days ago have just plummeted into nothingness. That's because of how much easier Mythic Plus has been made. Even the success rate of keys now has skyrocketed much higher up. So when it comes to Mythic Plus, it's all smiles, it's all happiness, things are good again now, congrats. So we have to talk about another problem for today, if everything is good with Mythic Plus, which is the raid. Because right now we are having a pretty interesting set of situations going on in the raid. For starters, we are now almost a month into the release of the Mythic difficulty. This is the 4th week of Mythic Raid, so we are practically almost getting into the first month. And we have 9 kills of Queen Ansurek, the latest one being yesterday from End Myth Chinese Guild. So in about 25-26 days, you have gotten 9 kills of the last boss of the raid. Now, if you compare this to Razaget, which was the last boss of Vault of the Incarnates from the release of the Mythic Raid, which was on the 14th of December, so 25 or so days after that, it would be around January 10th, more or less, in terms of the same time frame that we have now in this season. We would be around here, around rank 20, rank 21 in the world. So, from Ansurek to Razaget, you have 9 kills now. You had over 20 kills when it comes to Vault of the Incarnates. Then you have also Aberus, because Aberus came out on May the 10th, so 25 or so days. We're talking about the 5th of June in the same time frame that we have now. And the result here would be even easier, because the 5th of June here, we are talking about around here. We're talking about 50 guilds killing the last boss. So we're going from the 9 of Ansurek to the 20 plus of Razaget to the 50 plus of Sarkareth. Then you have the last one, of course, which is Amir Josil. Amir Josil came out November the 17th, so 25 days after that would be around December 12th, more or less, which would be no need to scroll to other pages, because December the 12th would be practically around here. So 13 to 14. Hold on a second. We considered Amir Josil to be one of the toughest tiers in recent memory. Not even actually the entire tier, we have to be honest, it was practically the last 3 bosses. Smolderon, which was already hard, things got even worse then with Tindral, and Ferak himself was also quite tough. And that was considered very hard. We also had talks from the developers in trying to point out that they did not want this to be repeated, to have this kind of very easy early bosses, 1 pull, 2 pulls, and then massive blocks, 100 plus pulls, in this case with Smolderon, and then 300-400 plus pulls for bosses like Tindral and even Ferak. So many players were aware of the difficulty in Amir Josil. The Race to World First made lots of people talk because of the difficulty of these bosses, yet right now, even though many players would still consider Amir Josil perhaps a harder tier, technically speaking, there were more guilds killing Ferak back then compared to the guilds we have now killing Ansurek, because Ansurek is 9 and Ferak is 13 to 14. So actually, right now, numbers at hand, Nerub'Ar Palace is the hardest tier we have had, compared to Dragonflight by quite a bit. Definitely much more than Aberus, significantly more than Vault, and still harder than Amir Josil. You could even scale it down, not just from Farak, but from Tindral as well. Because, you know, perhaps Tindral was a bigger block than Farak was. So the reason why the kills on Farak are slowed down is because, you know, guilds were blocked on Tindral. So if you were to scale it down from the kills on Farak to the kills of Tindral, stopping again at roughly the same time, which was December the 12th, more or less, it will still be around 30 kills. So from the 12 of Farak to the 30 of Tindral. So you move back to Nerub'Ar Palace. Again, you check the kills this time not on Ansurek but on the boss before, which would be the Silken Court, and now you have 38. So you have about 31 to 32, maybe even 39, depending on the exact day we compare Amir Josil with Nerub'Ar Palace, and the numbers are practically the same. Yet, you know, if you were to ask quick fire response to players based on their memory, who do you think was harder, Tindral or Silken Court? Everyone would just tell you instantly Tindral. Tindral was so hard. Yet the amount of kills between Tindral and Silken Court are equal right now. And that's the situation we have right now. The amount of kills we have gotten in the raid, in the latter bosses, in the similar last three like we had in previous expansions and previous raid tiers. In this case it gets even worse because it's not the last three, it's the last four. So it is more reminiscent perhaps of something like, God forbid, Sepulchre, where you had the Jailer, you also had Lords of Dread, you also had Rygillon, and then you also had Anduin. You could even argue, okay, but Lords of Dread wasn't that difficult, it was also nerfed quite early, so it became much more easy to progress. Fine, even if you remove Lords of Dread, you have Alondrus. So it's Alondrus, Anduin, and then Rygillon, and then Jailer. So now you have 4 bosses in here as well, because Broad Twister has proven to be quite difficult to progress on, because, for example, easy comparison, if you look at the amount of guilds right now who have killed Broad Twister, you have at the moment, after the nerfs, there were significant nerfs to Broad Twister, you have almost 400 guilds. Then you compare the amount of guilds who have killed Rashanan, which is the boss that comes before Broad Twister, and the amount of guilds who killed Rashanan is 1700. This means that there are 1700 minus 400, 13. There are 1300 guilds right now stuck on Broad Twister, right? Because if they kill Rashanan and they haven't killed Broad Twister, I'm assuming they are progressing Broad Twister. That's how many there are. If you make the comparison instead between Broad Twister and the one after Broad Twister, which is Nexus Princess, there were 400 guilds killing Broad Twister, and then the amount of guilds who killed Nexus Princess are 150. So there are 250 guilds progressing on Nexus Princess. So there are 1300 stuck on Broad Twister and then 250 on Nexus Princess. And then you can do the same thing between Nexus Princess and the Silken Court. 150 for Nexus Princess and about 40, I think, for Silken Court. So there are about 110 guilds on Silken Court. So Silken Court to Nexus Princess is 110, Nexus Princess to Broad Twister is 250, but then Broad Twister to Rashanan is 1300. So the gap in there is also significantly much larger, as a much bigger block, even after the nerfs Broad Twister has received, which is nowhere near the level of cock blocks we had in Vault. In Vault, you had some difficult bosses, harder than the others, like for example, amongst these, Diurna was harder, sure, but early on, none of these bosses, like Datia for example, even Kurog, they weren't nearly as much of a block. In Aberrus, it's the same. There was one block, the 5th boss, Rashok, but it was a very item level, gated kind of boss. Very few mechanics to, to have to learn and wipe multiple times. It was only a matter of getting gear, and then it would go through. Zaskarn was mostly a mess up of Blizzard balancing of the mechanics of the boss, as well as completely under-tuning Magmorak. So you really didn't have anything on Aberrus close to Broad Twister. And then you had a Mirjosil, which was completely backloaded. The difficulty was all in the bottom 3. The first 3 were practically a breeze. The ones in the middle were decently balanced. Council, Nimue, and Larodar, they weren't particularly difficult bosses to go through. 50, maybe 70 pulls for the guilds with more problems on these bosses, but nothing too more than that. So So this is something that we are seeing back again in this tier. Way higher presence of 100 plus wipes on bosses that are not the last two, just to say. In this case, Ansurek and Silken Court, because both Nexus Princess and Ovinax did have multiple guilds, even now having 100 plus pulls. So for the vast majority of guilds, including World First Guild, but even the ones after, all of these 4 bosses will be 100 plus pull bosses. All of them, all the bottom 4, which is not something we have seen in a long time. As mentioned, we've only seen it once in the past, basically 3 expansions, in Shadowlands, in Sepulcher. That's the last time we have seen something like this. And you know, it was worth pointing out because we are currently at a big divide with what we just mentioned in comparison with Mythic Plus, right? Because Mythic Plus has gotten a large amount of changes, a large amount of positive changes for the player base, negative changes for the dungeons themselves becoming easier. Also, the byproduct of those positive changes is the fact that now characters will be able to get even more gear, especially outside of the raid. So all, as we mentioned, all of that hero track 4 out of 6 gear you were stuck on. If you were not able to clear +9s, now you can do it at +8. Fill your gear from 4 out of 6 hero track to 6 out of 6 hero track, gain 7 item levels on all of your gear, right? So there's also that for Mythic Plus. But for the raid, we haven't actually seen much of any improvements, because we have seen more than a week ago at this point the nerfs given to Broad Twister and the nerfs given to Nexus Princess. These seem to have made the bosses more killable for the top 100, top 150 guilds in the world. The ones below them were still struggling quite a lot, and not much else. And then you had Silken Court and Ansurek, which still haven't gotten that many significant nerfs. There has even been talk, for example, amongst the higher level guilds, the ones that are at the moment dealing with Ansurek, to not even, to not even start bothering killing Ansurek before next reset, because they assume it's gonna be nerfed. And the catch-up, the 3% damage and healing raid buff that will happen now on a weekly basis will start to actually have an effect and help them progress on this boss. Otherwise, there isn't even a point trying now because of how difficult it currently is. The problem also is the difficulty in mechanics, because certain bosses were difficult even in previous expansions. Like in Vault, you had bosses like Diurna, for example. In Aberus, you had bosses when they still were difficult, as we mentioned, like Rashok. And in Amir Josil, again, a boss like Smolderon. Much of the difficulty of these bosses came with the numbers. So it came with staying alive, the brutal numbers they had, like the Smolderon healing requirements, for example. In the fight, the amount of damage you were taking was most of the difficulty in the encounter. Same, for example, for Rashok. Most of the difficulty was in how difficult it was to stay alive, or perhaps how tight the DPS check was. And then that's something that didn't require too many nerfs, because eventually you just outgear it, so it becomes a reasonably simple fight compared to others. And then you had other fights like Tindral, which weren't really that much about numbers. Weren't really that much about a super tight DPS check or brutal healing requirements, but rather mechanics, being able to survive the mechanics. And that's always a doozy for Blizzard to fix, because of course having to nerf a mechanic in its difficulty will be much more drastic than simply nerfing numbers, right? If players have too much trouble dodging these beams, then you simply have to nerf the amount of beams spawning, the amount of times the beams are spawning, because those beams are going to one-shot you. There is no point in nerfing the numbers of those beams. Or if you're fighting Farak, and one of the problems of Farak is dodging the lines, because if you get hit by 2 lines, you get 1 shot. You have to start nerfing the damage of the lines so much that eventually you stop being one-shot by the lines. This is something that in this tier we're having some problems with, clearly, because of the last 4 bosses, the only one that is similar to it's a numbers check type of boss, so eventually it will basically nerf itself, because the guilds getting more and more gear will simply be able to start overpowering, brute forcing the fight, is Nexus Princess. Nexus Princess is single target heavy damage on the targets of Assassinate, on the targets of the charge that tick for tons of damage, which has been nerfed already, but clearly is still quite difficult for many guilds. That will get easier with time. With more and more vaults, more and more crafted items, the 3% stacking buff we're getting now in the raid. So that really won't need any more nerfs. It will just be fine by itself. However, fights like Broad Twister, where the entire room is covered in stuff on the ground, and then you have the dispels on the players, being careful not to dispel them to root other players, while you also have to interrupt the worms, but then you also have to group together the small adds, and then you have to be careful with placing properly the circles to break open the eggs. That is harder to nerf because that's not really as much of a numbers problem. It's more about a coordination problem that you have to be good at as a guild. Same goes for Silken Court. You know, Silken Court has a very lax healing profile. It's not very very demanding on the healers. The DPS check is also quite lax now after the nerf to their HP. It's mostly about the movement. It's mostly about splitting the group into two colors, having to practically play two 10-man groups, and all of the different movements you have to go through. And that's also harder to nerf because, for example, the punishment for getting two colors close to each other is a one-shot. So there is not much nerfing you can do to get in one-shot right now. And then lastly, of course, the last boss, which has lots of mechanical requirements, different ones in different phases. The TLDR is, the raid is a bit too challenging at the moment. And given the severe amount of improvements given to Mythic Plus, we were kind of wondering, where was Blizzard at when it came to balancing the raid? If we think that this 3% stacking raid buff that will begin starting next reset in a couple of days will be enough to fix some of the issues of progression of some of these bosses, or if some of these will require an even heavier hand when it comes to balancing, especially the largest one, of course, the one that stands out the most right now for most guilds. We're not talking about the last two, where only 10, 20, 30 guilds are at right now. We're talking about bosses like Brood Twister, where over 1,000 guilds are still currently stuck at 1 month into the tier. That is perhaps the more worrying part for Blizzard when it comes to balancing the raid at the moment. So this was worth highlighting given the current situation in the raid. Compare the stark comparison between the doom, despair, and depression that is currently going down in the progression of the raid compared to the flower, sun, and happiness that has just been going down in Mythic Plus after the sets of nerfs that the activity received recently. So with this thought experiment of trying to compare currently the two activities right now and their state as we get towards the end of the 4th reset of the season, we are now leaving each other on this Monday. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having support the channel by watching the video, as well as liking and commenting down below, together with subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't know, I would still be happy with fixing the raid by giving us more achievements and titles and mounts. Keep the difficulty the same, just more rewards.